After a 16-hour shift, Nurse Arya just wanted coffee and silence. But when a disabled Navy SEAL walked into that diner on crutches, scanning for a place to sit, something chilling happened. One by one, every person in that room looked away, turned him down. The war hero who'd sacrificed his leg for his country couldn't find a single soul willing to share a table. Except her. She had no idea that inviting him to sit would trigger a chain of events so massive, so overwhelming, that 200 combat veterans would show up at her doorstep with something that would change everything. What happened next wasn't just gratitude, it was a reckoning. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The morning sun had barely cracked the horizon when Arya Collins heard what sounded like thunder rolling through her quiet neighborhood. She stirred in bed, groggy from exhaustion, thinking a storm must be moving in. But as the rumbling grew louder, more distinct, more rhythmic, something didn't feel right. Thunder doesn't hold formation. Thunder doesn't stand at attention. She pushed herself out of bed and stumbled to her window, pulling back the curtain with sleep-heavy hands. What she saw stopped her heart cold. Outside her modest home, stretching down her street as far as she could see, stood over 200 men. Navy SEALs, veterans, warriors, some in dress uniforms with medals catching the early light, others in tactical gear, some on crutches, some in wheelchairs, some missing limbs. Every single one standing in perfect military formation, eyes forward, waiting. At the front of this brotherhood stood a man she recognized immediately. The disabled Navy SEAL from the diner. The one with the pinned pant leg and the crutch. The one nobody would sit with. Except her. And now he was here, at her door, with an army behind him. Arya's hands trembled as they gripped the windowsill. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. 24 hours ago, she'd simply shared a table. She'd bought a stranger breakfast. She'd done what any decent human being would do, hadn't she? But somehow, that simple act, that one moment of basic human kindness, had triggered something so massive, so overwhelming, it defied logic. How does sharing a booth lead to this? How does one cup of coffee, one meal, one conversation transform into 200 combat veterans standing outside your home at dawn? What could possibly explain the envelope in the veteran's hand, the folded flag beside him, the tears already forming in the eyes of men trained never to break? But this story, this moment that would change everything Arya thought she knew about the power of simple kindness. This didn't start with thunder at her door. It started 24 hours earlier, in a diner where rejection tasted bitter and one woman chose to do what everyone else refused. 24 hours before that army of warriors would gather at her door, Arya Collins was just trying to survive another shift. At 28 years old, she'd been an ICU nurse for 6 years, and every single one of those years had carved deeper lines of exhaustion into her face. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. The kind that lived in your bones and reminded you with every breath that you'd seen things most people only experience in their worst nightmares. Her shift that night had been 16 hours of controlled chaos. 16 hours of ventilators beeping, families sobbing in waiting rooms, and making split-second decisions that meant the difference between someone going home or going to the morgue. She'd held the hand of a dying grandmother while her grandchildren said goodbye through a tablet screen. She'd helped resuscitate a teenager who'd wrapped his car around a telephone pole. She'd comforted a young mother whose premature baby fought for every breath in the NICU down the hall. This was her normal. This was what she'd signed up for. This was what she was born to do. Because Arya understood sacrifice in a way most people never would. Her father, Marcus Collins, had been a Marine. 2 tours in Iraq, decorated for valor, the kind of man who walked a little taller in his uniform and spoke about duty like it was oxygen. He'd come home with invisible wounds that no doctor could stitch, no medication could heal. She'd watched him fight demons nobody else could see, watched him struggle to fit back into a world that had moved on without him. He died 7 years ago from complications the VA said weren't service-related, but Arya knew better. Her father had given everything to his country, and his country had let him fade away quietly, filing him under statistics and budget cuts. That's why she became a nurse. That's why she poured everything into every patient, every family, every impossible situation. She was trying to save the people the world forgot about, the ones slipping through the cracks, the ones who'd given everything and gotten nothing back. Arya had no idea her father's legacy was about to come full circle in the most unexpected way. She had no idea that within hours, she'd understand exactly what it meant when warriors recognize one of their own. If you've ever felt invisible after giving everything, if you've ever wondered whether kindness even matters anymore, then stay with this story. Because what happens next proves that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe pays attention. Dawn was breaking over the small town when Arya finally clocked out. Her scrubs wrinkled and her mind still replaying the faces of patients she'd fought to keep alive through the night. She didn't go straight home. She never did after the really hard shifts. Instead, her car turned almost on autopilot toward Riverside Diner, the same place she'd been going for years, the ritual that helped her transition from the fluorescent hell of the ICU back into something resembling normal life. Riverside Diner was the kind of place that existed in every working-class town in America. Red vinyl booths patched with duct tape, laminated menus sticky with syrup, the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee thick enough to taste. The same faces occupied the same seats every morning, truckers fueling up before long hauls, construction workers gulping down eggs before the job site opened, elderly regulars who'd been coming here since the place opened in 1973. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't trying to be. It was honest food, honest people, and honest exhaustion all under one roof. Arya pushed through the door, the little bell chiming her arrival, and headed straight for her usual spot. A corner booth where she could face the wall and let the world fade away for just a little while. The waitress, Linda, 50-something with kind eyes and hands that had poured a million cups of coffee, didn't even ask anymore. She just brought the pot, filled Arya's cup to the brim, and squeezed her shoulder in that silent acknowledgement that said, "I see you, I know you're tired, and you're doing good work." Arya wrapped her hands around the warm mug and let her eyes close for just a moment. Just one moment of peace. One moment where she wasn't responsible for keeping hearts beating and lungs breathing. One moment where she could just be a tired woman drinking mediocre coffee in a worn-out booth. The diner hummed with its familiar soundtrack, the sizzle of the griddle, the murmur of morning conversation, the clink of silverware on ceramic plates. But peace, real peace, is always temporary, especially for people like Arya who spend their lives showing up for others. The door chime rang again, and though she didn't open her eyes yet, though she didn't know it yet, everything was about to change. Peace was about to be interrupted, and it would lead to something she never saw coming. The door chimed, and Arya heard it, but didn't look up. She was too lost in that precious quiet, that coffee-warm moment of nothingness. But something shifted in the diner. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed texture, became quieter, more careful. The kind of hush that falls over a room when something uncomfortable walks in. Mason Hale stood in the doorway, 6'2" of lean muscle and hard-earned scars, wearing full camouflage fatigues that still smelled faintly of military-issue detergent. His face was weathered beyond his 34 years, the kind of weathering that comes from sleeping in deserts and mountains, from watching sunrises in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. On his left shoulder, the Navy SEAL Trident insignia caught the morning light. His right hand gripped a military-issue crutch, supporting his weight, because his left pant leg was folded up and pinned neatly at the knee. Where his leg should have been, there was nothing but absence and the ghost of what he'd sacrificed. He scanned the diner with the tactical awareness that never really leaves men like him, looking for a seat, just wanting a place to rest and eat and feel normal for a few minutes. He made his way toward the first booth, two middle-aged men in work shirts, finishing their hash browns. Mason approached with a slight nod, polite, respectful. "Mind if I sit here? Just need a spot for breakfast." The men exchanged a glance, uncomfortable, and one of them cleared his throat. "Actually, we're waiting for someone." Sorry, they weren't waiting for anyone. Their plates were nearly empty. But Mason nodded, understanding immediately, and moved on. He approached a family booth, mom, dad, two kids coloring on placemats. "Excuse me, would you have room for one more?" The father didn't even meet his eyes. "Sorry, we need the space." There were two empty seats. But Mason didn't argue. He just adjusted his grip on the crutch and kept moving. An elderly couple sat near the window, their breakfast barely touched, plenty of room in their booth. Mason stopped beside their table, waiting to be acknowledged. They saw him. They absolutely saw him. But they suddenly became very interested in their eggs, eyes down, pretending he didn't exist at all. Pattern established. Every single person in that diner had looked at this Navy SEAL, this man who'd given his leg for their freedom to sit comfortably in that booth, and they'd all decided he wasn't worth the awkwardness of sharing space. Mason had faced enemy combatants without flinching. He'd run toward gunfire when everyone else ran away. He'd pulled wounded brothers out of kill zones and kept fighting with shrapnel in his side. But this quiet, polite rejection from the very people he'd bled for? This was a different kind of battle. And if this makes your blood boil, if you can't stand watching our veterans treated like inconveniences, then comment, respect our vets, right now. Let's drown out the ignorance with something louder. Mason stood there in the middle of the diner, feeling more exposed than he ever had in a combat zone. At least in war, you knew who the enemy was. Here, these were supposed to be his people, the ones he'd fought for, the ones whose freedom to enjoy a peaceful breakfast had cost him everything. And they couldn't even look at him. He turned toward the last option, the corner booth where a woman sat alone, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes closed like she was praying or maybe just too exhausted to keep them open. He approached slowly, hesitant now, bracing himself for that familiar sting of rejection. His crutch clicked against the tile floor, announcing his presence before his voice could. He waited a beat, giving her a chance to pretend she didn't notice him, to avoid this uncomfortable moment like everyone else had. But when she opened her eyes and looked up at him, something in her expression was different. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't looking through him. She was seeing him. Arya's gaze traveled from his face to the SEAL insignia on his shoulder, down to the crutch, to the pinned pant leg, and then back to his eyes. And in that moment, something clicked. Maybe it was her father's face she saw. Maybe it was all the veterans she'd treated in the ICU who'd come home broken and forgotten. Maybe it was just basic human decency that hadn't been trained out of her by a world that taught people to look away from discomfort. Whatever it was, when Mason asked, "Would you mind if I sit here?" his voice already preparing for rejection, already planning his retreat, Arya didn't hesitate. "Please," she said, and she meant it. "I'd like the company." The relief that washed over Mason's face was immediate and profound. His shoulders dropped half an inch. His jaw unclenched. The guard he'd been holding up since walking through that door lowered just slightly, just enough to let a sliver of hope back in. He slid into the booth across from her, carefully positioning his crutch against the wall, and for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to breathe. The diner was watching now. The same people who'd turned him away were stealing glances, some of their faces colored with shame, others simply curious about why this woman had done what they couldn't. Linda, the waitress, brought Mason a menu and coffee without being asked, her small act of kindness making up for the coldness of her other customers. Neither Arya nor Mason knew it yet, but this moment, this simple decision to share a booth, to acknowledge another human being's worth, would ripple further than either of them could possibly imagine. Sometimes the smallest acts of humanity echo the loudest. The coffee arrived steaming, and with it, the awkwardness that always exists between strangers began to fade. Mason wrapped his hands around the mug like it was anchoring him to something solid, something real. Arya ordered her usual, scrambled eggs and wheat toast, and asked Mason if he'd eaten yet. He hadn't. Hadn't really had an appetite since walking into that diner and feeling the weight of rejection settle over him like a wet blanket. But something about this woman, about the way she'd invited him to sit without pity in her eyes, made him feel hungry again, human again. They started with small talk. The weather, the quality of the coffee, how long the diner had been here. Safe territory. But small talk has a way of cracking open when two people who've seen the darkness recognize it in each other. Mason noticed the hospital badge clipped to Arya's scrubs, still hanging around her neck like she'd forgotten it was there. "Long shift?" he asked. She laughed, tired and real. 16 hours. ICU nurse. Some nights you save everyone. Some nights you lose everyone. Tonight was somewhere in between. Mason nodded, understanding immediately. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. And then, because something about this woman made him want to be honest, made him feel safe enough to crack open the armor he'd been wearing since coming home, he told her. Not the sanitized version he gave at VA appointments. Not the hero story civilians wanted to hear. The truth. He'd lost his leg and 3 of his teammates to an IED in Kandahar. They'd been on a routine patrol. Nothing ever really feels routine, but you tell yourself it is to keep from going insane. When the world exploded into fire and chaos, he didn't talk about the blast itself. Everyone always wanted the dramatic details, the action movie version. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was waking up in a German hospital 3 days later and realizing that the life he'd built, the identity he'd forged, the man he'd been, all of it was gone. The hard part was learning to walk again when your brain still expected a leg to be there. Phantom pains that shot through limbs that no longer existed. The hard part was looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back. The hard part was coming home to a country that thanked you for your service and then turned away when you needed a place to sit. Arya listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. And when he finished, when the words had emptied out of him like water from a broken dam, she spoke. "My father was a Marine," she said softly. 2 tours in Iraq. He came home with wounds nobody could see. PTSD, survivor's guilt, night terrors that made him afraid to sleep. The VA kept telling him he was fine, that he just needed to adjust. But I watched him disappear a little more every day. He died 7 years ago. They said it wasn't service-related, but I know better. He gave everything to this country, and it gave him nothing back. The connection between them deepened in that moment, shifted from polite strangers to 2 people who understood sacrifice in their bones. 2 people who'd watched the cost of service up close. 2 people tired of a world that praised heroes in speeches but abandoned them in diners. Mason's eyes, which had been guarded and careful, softened with recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way that went beyond words. "I'm sorry too," Arya replied, looking at the place where his leg should have been. "For all of it. For what you lost. For what you're still losing every day." Mason cleared his throat, fighting back emotion he'd been trained never to show. "I'm in town for a veterans support group," he said, shifting the weight of the conversation. "Trying to find purpose again. Trying to figure out who I am when being a SEAL was the only thing I ever knew." But Arya was about to do something that would trigger a chain reaction across an entire brotherhood. Something that would prove to Mason that purpose finds you when you least expect it, in the most unexpected places. An hour had passed in what felt like minutes. The kind of conversation that makes time irrelevant, where the world outside the booth ceases to exist, and all that matters is the connection being forged across a table sticky with syrup. Their plates had been empty for a while now, eggs gone cold, toast reduced to crumbs, coffee cups refilled 3 times by Linda, who seemed to understand that some conversations needed space to breathe. But eventually, as all things do, the moment had to end. Linda placed the check face down on the table between them, a gentle signal that other customers were waiting, that morning was turning into afternoon, that real life was calling them both back. Mason reached for his wallet immediately, that ingrained sense of responsibility that military men carry like a second skin. He'd been taught to pay his own way, to never be a burden, to handle his business with dignity and self-reliance. But before he could even get the worn leather out of his pocket, Arya had already caught Linda's eye and given her a subtle nod that spoke an entire conversation without words. The transaction was done. Paid. Finished. Mason looked up, confused, and then understanding dawned on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said, and there was protest in his voice, but also something else. Something that sounded like gratitude mixed with disbelief, like he couldn't quite comprehend why this stranger would extend such a simple kindness when everyone else in this diner had made it clear he wasn't welcome. Arya smiled, tired but genuine. "My dad would have wanted someone to do the same for him," she said simply. And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? She wasn't doing this for recognition or to feel good about herself or to prove some point to the people who'd rejected him. She was doing it because somewhere in the universe, in some parallel version of history, maybe someone had done the same for her father. Or maybe they hadn't, and that's why she needed to do it now. Maybe every act of kindness was a way of rewriting all the moments when kindness had been withheld. Mason sat there for a moment, processing, and then something shifted in his expression. A decision being made in real time. He pulled out his phone, hands that had once assembled rifles in the dark, now fumbling slightly with the touchscreen. Would it be okay if I got your contact information?" He asked, almost shy about it, like he was afraid she'd say no. afraid this connection would end the moment they walked out that door. "I'd like to stay in touch, if that's all right." Arya didn't hesitate. She rattled off her number while Mason typed it into his phone, his thumb moving carefully over each digit like he was defusing a bomb, making sure he got it exactly right. She thought it was just friendly. Just two people who'd shared a meaningful conversation, wanting to keep that thread alive. Maybe they'd text occasionally, check in on each other, become the kind of distant friends who remembered birthdays and sent holiday messages. She had no idea what Mason was already planning. No idea what this simple exchange of numbers would become. They stood up together, gathering their things, and Mason extended his hand. Arya shook it, feeling the calluses, the strength, the slight tremor of emotion he was working hard to control. "Thank you," he said, and those two words carried the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for sitting with me. Thank you for reminding me that humanity still exists." They walked out of that diner together and then parted ways in the parking lot, Mason heading toward a modest sedan with veteran plates, Arya toward her decade-old Honda that had seen better days. She drove home thinking that was just a nice breakfast, a good conversation, a small bright spot in an otherwise exhausting week. She had absolutely no idea what Mason was about to set in motion. And if you believe in paying kindness forward, if you believe these small moments matter more than we realize, then smash that like button right now. Show the algorithm what actually matters in this world. Mason drove back to his hotel in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, jaw clenched against the emotion rising in his chest like a tide he couldn't hold back. He made it to his room, closed the door behind him, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. And then, for the first time since walking into that diner, he let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. The rejection, the humiliation, and then, like light breaking through storm clouds, the unexpected grace of one woman who'd simply said yes when everyone else said no. He sat there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, letting it all wash over him. And then something shifted. That tactical mind that had kept him alive through impossible situations kicked into gear. He opened his laptop, fingers moving with purpose now, and logged into the encrypted network that connected Navy SEALs across the country. Active duty, retired, wounded, whole, all part of a brotherhood that transcended rank and circumstance. He stared at the blank message box for a moment, choosing his words carefully, and then he typed, "A nurse who actually gave a damn." He described everything. The diner, the rejection from every single person, the elderly couple who wouldn't even make eye contact, the families who suddenly needed space they hadn't needed before. And then he described Arya, how she'd invited him to sit without hesitation, how she'd listened to his story without pity, how she'd paid for his meal with quiet dignity. He included her father's story too, the Marine who'd served and suffered and died without the country he'd fought for ever really acknowledging what it had cost him. And then Mason typed the words that would change everything. She saw the man, not the injury. She honored her father's legacy by honoring one of ours. Time to show her what that means to us. He posted it to SEAL team forums, veteran networks, military brotherhood groups, anywhere warriors gathered online to share stories and support each other through the impossible transition from war to peace. Within an hour, 50 responses flooded in. By evening, over 200. What Mason started with one message was about to become something that small town had never witnessed. Because these men weren't just planning to thank her. They were organizing an operation. At the Virginia Beach SEAL compound, a retired operator named Chris Martinez was finishing his morning workout when his phone buzzed with a notification from the Brotherhood network. He read Mason's post, read it again, and then immediately forwarded it to his old team. Within minutes, his phone was ringing. "You see this?" his former teammate asked. "We doing something about this or what?" In San Diego, another group of retired SEALs gathered at a coffee shop saw the same post and started making calls. In Texas, Colorado, Florida, everywhere warriors had settled after their service. Phones lit up with the same message, the same story, the same collective rage at how one of their own had been treated, and the same profound respect for the woman who'd done what civilians should have done. This is when the phone trees activated. For those who don't know, a phone tree is a military communication method where one person calls three people, who each call three more, who each call three more, creating an exponential network of information that can mobilize hundreds of people in hours. Former teammates reached out to current operators. Squad leaders contacted their old platoons. The word spread like wildfire through a community bound by something deeper than friendship. Bound by shared sacrifice, shared trauma, shared understanding that the world outside would never fully comprehend what they'd been through together. And then someone, a retired SEAL commander in North Carolina, typed 4 words that changed everything. Operation Gratitude Strike. Suddenly, this wasn't just emotional support or online solidarity. This was a mission. And missions require planning, logistics, coordination. They created a secure group chat. Assigned roles. One team handled travel logistics. Who could drive, who needed flights, where people would stay. Another team handled fundraising. The donations started immediately. $50 here from a young, enlisted SEAL. $500 there from a retired officer. $5,000 from team emergency funds that had been sitting idle, waiting for a moment that mattered. By the time the sun set on Mason's post, they'd raised $50,000. By midnight, $100,000. Within 18 hours, $200,000 had been contributed by warriors who understood that when someone honors one of you, they honor all of you. While Arya slept peacefully after her exhausting shift, completely unaware that her name was being spoken in hundreds of conversations across the country, an army was assembling. And she was about to find out what happens when you show humanity to warriors who never forget. If you stand with our veterans, if you believe this is what honor looks like, then comment, "Brotherhood never forgets," right now. Let's flood this comment section and show the world what loyalty means. The next morning arrived with all the glamour of laundry that needed folding and bills that needed paying. Arya's day off, the precious 48 hours between shifts where she tried to remember what it felt like to be a regular person with a regular life. She dragged herself to the grocery store, navigating the aisles with a list written on the back of a hospital memo, choosing generic brands because the name brands were luxuries her nurse's salary couldn't quite justify. She bought the essentials: eggs, bread, coffee that wasn't as good as the diners but cost half as much, frozen vegetables because fresh ones went bad before she could use them with her unpredictable schedule. Back home, she threw in a load of laundry, scrubs mostly, the uniform of someone who spent more time saving other people's lives than living her own. She sat at her kitchen table with a stack of bills: rent, utilities, student loans from nursing school that would follow her into retirement, a car payment on the Honda that was one breakdown away from becoming unfixable. She did the math she did every month, the careful calculation of which bills got paid in full and which ones could be stretched another 2 weeks. This was her reality. This was the life of someone who'd chosen service over salary, who'd picked a profession that asked for everything and paid just enough to keep you coming back. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Then she remembered. Mason from the diner. "You changed my perspective. Thank you." Simple. Direct. The way military men communicated. She smiled, genuinely touched, and typed back, "I'm glad we met. Take care of yourself." She thought nothing more of it. Just a nice moment. A brief connection, now filed away in the category of good memories from an otherwise exhausting week. She made herself a sandwich, planning a quiet evening at home. Maybe a movie, maybe just sleep, maybe finally finishing that book she'd been trying to read for 3 months. Arya had no idea that in exactly 3 hours, her entire world would shift on its axis. That everything she thought she knew about the impact of simple kindness was about to be rewritten. That the universe was about to answer a question she didn't even know she'd been asking. On the highway 40 miles outside of town, a convoy unlike anything that small community had ever seen was making its way through the countryside. Trucks with veteran plates. Motorcycles with military insignia painted on the tanks. SUVs carrying men who'd driven through the night. They weren't traveling together in one organized line. That would have drawn too much attention, raised too many questions. But they were all headed to the same destination, guided by the same coordinates Mason had shared in the secure group chat. Arya's address. A modest house on a quiet street where a woman who'd shown simple human decency was about to discover that the military never forgets its own, and they sure as hell never forget the people who honor them. These men had come from everywhere. Virginia Beach, where the SEAL community ran deep and strong. San Diego, where the Pacific Fleet warriors called home. A group from Texas had driven 12 straight hours, switching drivers at rest stops, fueled by bad coffee and unshakable purpose. Others had flown into the regional airport and rented cars, arriving in business casual clothes with duffel bags in their trunks containing their uniforms, their medals, their proof of service. Some were active duty, having taken emergency leave for what they'd only described to their commanders as a family matter. And in a way, that's exactly what this was. Some were retired, gray in their beards now, but still carrying themselves with that unmistakable bearing of men who'd faced death and decided it wasn't impressive enough to fear. Some were wounded, missing limbs, bearing scars, carrying invisible injuries that no Purple Heart could adequately represent. Mason Hale was in the lead vehicle, a rented pickup truck driven by his former team leader who'd flown in from North Carolina the night before. Mason sat in the passenger seat, his crutch propped between them, his hands fidgeting with nervous energy in a way they never had before combat missions. Funny how facing enemy fire felt less terrifying than this. Facing a woman who'd shown him kindness and trying to adequately express what that meant. He checked his phone for the 100th time, reading through the group chat where final coordination was happening in real time. 217 confirmed attendees. Some in full dress uniforms, medals polished and ribbons straight. Others in casual clothes, jeans and SEAL team shirts, baseball caps with Trident insignias. A few had brought their service dogs, those four-legged therapists who kept the nightmares at bay and the anxiety manageable. The plan was simple, executed with the kind of precision that only military minds could coordinate on short notice. They would arrive in waves, parking strategically to avoid blocking traffic or causing panic among neighbors. They would form up in front of Arya's house at exactly 0600 hours, dawn, when the light would be perfect and the world would be quiet enough to hear what needed to be said. Mason would approach the door first. The others would stand at attention behind him. And then they would show this woman, this nurse who understood sacrifice because she'd watched her father carry it until it killed him, that her simple act of humanity had been witnessed, recorded, and honored by an entire brotherhood. What was about to happen on Arya's quiet street would become the talk of the entire community. The neighbors would tell their grandchildren. The local news would scramble to cover it. Social media would explode with videos and photos. But none of that mattered to the men converging on that address. They weren't doing this for attention or recognition. They were doing it because in their world, in the warrior culture that civilians would never fully understand, there were rules that couldn't be broken. And one of those rules was simple. When someone honors you, you honor them back tenfold. Dawn broke over the quiet residential street with the kind of gentle light that promised an ordinary Saturday morning. But what was about to unfold was anything but ordinary. The first vehicle arrived at 0545, parking 3 houses down from Arya's modest ranch-style home with the peeling paint and the small garden she barely had time to maintain. Then another vehicle, and another. They came in a steady stream, silent as ghosts, parking with tactical precision that left space for residents to leave if needed, that didn't block driveways or mailboxes, that showed respect even in their arrival. One by one, men emerged from trucks and cars and motorcycles, closing doors quietly, nodding to each other with the wordless communication of people who'd operated in silence before, who understood that some moments required reverence more than conversation. They began to take their positions, forming up on the sidewalk and lawn with military precision that came as naturally as breathing. No one needed to direct them. They'd done formations 1,000 times. In boot camp, on deployment, at ceremonies for fallen brothers. This was muscle memory mixed with purpose. Over 200 men, and the diversity of their circumstances told the whole story of military service. Some stood tall in dress blue uniforms, medals catching the early morning light, silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts representing blood spilled and bodies broken. Others wore casual clothes, jeans and SEAL team shirts, the unofficial uniform of warriors who no longer needed to prove anything. Some had service dogs beside them, German shepherds and Labradors trained to sense panic attacks and interrupt nightmares, their presence a reminder that not all wounds are visible. Some were in wheelchairs, legs lost to IEDs or bullets or the 1,000 violent ways war takes pieces of men. Some stood on prosthetics, like Mason, their bodies rebuilt but never quite the same. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains twitched in windows up and down the street. Mr. Peterson, the retired teacher 2 houses down, stepped onto his porch in his bathrobe, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips as he tried to process what he was seeing. Mrs. Chun across the street grabbed her phone, not sure if she should be calling the police or recording history. Children pressed their faces against windows, eyes wide, asking their parents what was happening. Who are all those men? Why are they here? The questions hung in the air unanswered because nobody knew. Nobody except the 217 veterans standing in formation, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Mason stood at the front, positioned directly in line with Arya's front door. In his left hand, he held an envelope, thick with something important. In his right hand, balanced carefully against his crutch, he held a folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals, the kind that had draped coffins of heroes. Behind him, a retired SEAL commander held a large ceremonial check, the kind you see in lottery commercials, the numbers printed large enough to read from across the street. Another veteran, younger, maybe late 20s, held a bouquet of flowers, yellow roses, the color of friendship and new beginnings. They'd thought of everything, every detail, every symbol, every element carefully chosen to communicate what words alone could never fully express. The formation was complete. The moment was here, inside her home, behind those walls and that front door with the wreath she'd hung last Christmas and forgotten to take down. Arya was about to wake up to something that would bring her to her knees. Something that would shatter her understanding of how the world works and rebuild it into something better, something more hopeful, something that proved kindness isn't just noticed, it's honored. If you can feel what's about to happen, if you can sense the magnitude of this moment, then share this video right now. This moment needs to be seen. This is what humanity looks like when it remembers what matters. Arya stirred in her sleep, consciousness pulling her slowly from dreams she wouldn't remember into a reality she couldn't yet comprehend. There was sound, deep, rhythmic, like thunder rolling across the sky, but different somehow, more sustained, more deliberate. She tried to ignore it, tried to sink back into the blessed oblivion of sleep that nurses guard like treasure, but the sound persisted, growing, building, not fading like a storm passing overhead, but holding steady, as if the thunder had decided to stop and stay and wait. Her eyes opened, groggy and confused, squinting at the morning light filtering through her bedroom curtains. A storm? She didn't remember the forecast calling for rain. The sound continued, that low rumble that made the windows vibrate slightly in their frames. She pushed herself up, joints protesting from too many hours on her feet, too many shifts that blurred together into one endless marathon of saving and losing and trying again. She shuffled toward the window, still half asleep, expecting to see dark clouds gathering over the neighborhood, maybe rain starting to fall on her neglected garden. She pulled back the curtain and froze, completely, utterly froze. Every muscle in her body locked in place as her brain tried desperately to process what her eyes were seeing. Men, hundreds of them, standing in perfect military formation in her yard, spilling onto her street, lined up with precision that defied coincidence. They weren't moving. They were at attention, shoulders back, chins up, eyes forward. Some in dress uniforms that gleamed with medals and ribbons. Some in casual clothes, but standing with the same rigid discipline. Some with service dogs sitting obediently at their sides. Some in wheelchairs. Some on crutches. Some missing limbs. And at the front, directly in line with her front door, stood a face she recognized immediately. The Navy SEAL from the diner. The man nobody would sit with. The man she'd invited to share her booth because it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. Mason. He stood there on his crutch, holding something in his hands. She couldn't quite make out what from this distance, her mind still struggling to accept that this was real, that this was happening, that over 200 men were standing outside her modest home at dawn for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Arya's hands started shaking. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream, some bizarre exhaustion-induced hallucination brought on by too many double shifts and not enough sleep. But the rumbling sound made sense now. It wasn't thunder. It was them. The collective presence of 200 bodies, 200 heartbeats, 200 warriors who'd traveled from across the country for something she couldn't yet comprehend. She stumbled backward from the window, her mind racing. What was this? Why were they here? Had something happened? Was she in trouble? No, that didn't make sense. They weren't surrounding her house like a threat. They were standing at attention like a ceremony, like an honor. But for what? For who? She threw on the first clothes she could find, jeans, a sweatshirt, not caring that her hair was a mess, or that she had no makeup on, or that she probably looked exactly like someone who'd just been shocked out of sleep by an army on her lawn. She rushed through her house, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and reached her front door. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. This was the moment. The moment everything changed. She took one breath, then another, and pulled the door open. The sight that met her was even more overwhelming up close. 200 faces turned toward her in perfect synchronization. Dead silence fell over the street. Every eye was on her. Every single pair of eyes belonging to men who'd seen war, who'd faced death, who'd sacrificed pieces of themselves for a country that didn't always remember to say thank you. And they were all looking at her like she was the most important person in the world. What they were about to tell her would explain everything and change her life forever. Mason stepped forward, his crutch clicking against the concrete walkway leading to Arya's front door, each step deliberate and measured. The morning sun caught the seal trident on his uniform, making it gleam like a promise being kept. He stopped 3 feet from where Arya stood frozen in her doorway, her hand still gripping the doorframe, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence. "Miss Collins," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "yesterday you did something nobody else would." He paused, letting those words settle over the silent street, over the 200 men standing witness, over the neighbors watching from their windows. "I walked into that diner after serving my country for 12 years. I'd lost my leg and 3 of my brothers in Kandahar. I'd given everything I had to give, and every single person in that diner, every single one, turned me away when I asked for a place to sit." Arya's hand went to her mouth, tears already forming, the full weight of what he'd experienced hitting her now in a way it hadn't in the moment. Mason continued, his voice gaining strength. "You saw a human being. You saw sacrifice. You saw what everyone else refused to see. You didn't see the crutch or the missing leg or the uniform that made people uncomfortable. You saw a man who needed a seat and a conversation and a reminder that he still mattered in this world." He shifted his weight, and behind him, 200 warriors remained absolutely still, their silence more powerful than any applause could ever be. "In our world, Ms. Collins, we have a code that supersedes everything else. It's simple. It's absolute. Never leave a man behind. You didn't leave me behind yesterday. When everyone else walked away, when everyone else made excuses, when everyone else decided their comfort mattered more than my dignity, you pulled out a chair. You didn't leave me behind." Mason gestured broadly to the formation behind him, his arms sweeping across the assembled brotherhood. "This is what happens when you honor one of us. We honor you back." These men came from Virginia, California, Texas, Florida, Colorado, from every corner of this country. Some drove all night. Some flew in and rented cars. Some took emergency leave from active duty. Because when word spread about what you did, about who you are, about your father who served and suffered and died without the recognition he deserved, we knew we had to show you what your kindness means. The veteran holding the large ceremonial check stepped forward, standing beside Mason. Mason took it, holding it up so Arya could see the numbers printed across it. $200,000. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe. "This is from brothers who know what it means to be seen, to be valued, to be treated like you matter," Mason said, his voice cracking now, the emotion breaking through the military composure. 217 warriors contributed to this. Some gave $50. Some gave $5,000. Every single dollar represents a man who understands what you did and wants to make sure you understand what it meant. Another veteran stepped forward, the one holding the folded American flag. Mason took it reverently, cradling it like the sacred object it was. "This flag flew over our base in Virginia Beach," he said softly. "It's been carried into combat zones. It's been folded by the hands of men who've said goodbye to their brothers. And now it's yours, because you honored your father's legacy by honoring one of us. You are the daughter of a Marine, and you proved yesterday that service runs in your blood. Not the service of wearing a uniform, but the service of seeing people who've become invisible and choosing to make them matter again." Arya couldn't hold it together anymore. The tears came in a flood, streaming down her face as her body shook with sobs she couldn't control. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, by the beauty of humanity she'd stopped believing existed, by the realization that her simple act of decency had rippled out into something she never could have imagined. Mason stepped closer, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle, almost a whisper. "You changed my life yesterday. You reminded me why I served. Why we all served. To protect people like you. People who still know what honor looks like. Thank you. If this is what the world needs more of, if this is the kind of humanity you want to see celebrated and amplified, then subscribe and hit that bell right now. Stand with kindness. Stand with the warriors who never forget. Stand with the belief that one person can change everything." The moment broke open like a dam giving way. Neighbors who'd been watching from their windows couldn't stay inside anymore. Doors opened up and down the street, and people emerged onto their porches and lawns, drawn by something they couldn't name but could absolutely feel. Mrs. Chun was crying openly, her phone forgotten in her hand. Mr. Peterson had set down his coffee mug and was standing at attention himself, his own military service from decades ago flooding back in a rush of memory and pride. Children asked their parents what was happening, and for once, parents had an answer worth giving. Something beautiful, something that reminds us what people can be. Within 20 minutes, local news crews arrived. Someone had tipped them off, probably one of the SEALs themselves, understanding that this moment needed to be documented, needed to be shared, needed to become more than just a private exchange between warriors and a nurse. Cameras captured everything. The check being handed over, the flag being presented, Arya sobbing in Mason's arms while 200 men stood witness. The reporter, a veteran herself, could barely hold the microphone steady as she tried to narrate what she was seeing. By noon, the story had gone viral. Video clips spread across social media like wildfire. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Every platform lit up with the same footage, the same story, the same overwhelming response from people who'd forgotten that this kind of humanity still existed. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares. Comment sections flooded with people tagging veterans they knew, thanking them, apologizing for all the times they'd looked away when they should have looked closer. Back at Riverside Diner, the patrons who'd been there that morning, the ones who'd rejected Mason, who'd made excuses, who'd avoided eye contact, they saw the news. The middle-aged men in the work shirts who'd claimed they were waiting for someone when their plates were already half empty. The family who'd said they needed the space when 2 seats sat obviously vacant. The elderly couple who'd simply looked away like Mason was invisible. They saw themselves in that story, saw their own shame broadcast to the world, and they understood exactly what they'd done, what they'd failed to do. The diner owner, a man named Frank who'd run that place for 30 years, called Arya that afternoon. His voice was thick with emotion and apology. "I had no idea," he said. "I saw him get turned away, and I didn't do anything. I just let it happen like it was normal. Like it was okay. I'm so sorry." Arya, gracious even in the midst of her own overwhelming emotions, told him what mattered wasn't that he'd failed in that moment. What mattered was what he chose to do next. The community was transformed overnight. Veterans who'd been living quietly, invisibly, suddenly found themselves approached in grocery stores, thanked in parking lots, offered seats and meals and conversations. The story had cracked something open in the collective consciousness, made people realize how often they looked away from discomfort, how often they chose convenience over compassion. Across the country, veterans reached out to Arya with their own stories. The times they'd been rejected, forgotten, treated like ghosts haunting a country that had moved on without them. Her inbox overflowed with messages. Her phone rang constantly. The impact was spreading far beyond one street, in one small town. And then Arya did something nobody expected. 3 days after the morning that changed everything, she held a press conference in her modest living room, surrounded by Mason and several of the warriors who'd been part of that formation. She announced that she was using part of the money, a significant portion, to create a foundation dedicated to helping veterans transition to civilian life. Mental health support, job training, housing assistance, all the things her father had needed and never received. "If one breakfast can do this," she said, her voice steady now, strengthened by purpose, "imagine what intentional action can accomplish." Imagine what happens when we don't just honor veterans one day a year, but actually show up for them every single day. The room erupted in applause, but Mason was quiet, his expression a mixture of pride and something else. Something deeper. Because there was one more thing people needed to know about what happened that day, one more piece of the story that would reveal just how far this ripple effect would travel. 1 week after the morning that changed everything, Arya and Mason walked through the door of Riverside Diner together. The same bell chimed their arrival. The same smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee filled the air, but everything else was different. The conversations didn't just quiet when they entered, they stopped completely. Every head turned. Every eye watched as they made their way across the familiar tile floor toward that corner booth, the one where this whole story had begun, where a simple act of human decency had triggered a chain reaction that was still rippling outward. They slid into the same seats they'd occupied 7 days earlier, Arya facing the wall, Mason with his crutch propped in the same spot against the vinyl. Linda the waitress appeared immediately, but this time her eyes were red-rimmed, tears threatening to spill over as she looked at them. "Your meals are on the house," she said, her voice shaking. "Frank insists. And honestly, so do I. What you did, what both of you did, it reminded all of us what we're supposed to be." She poured their coffee with trembling hands and walked away before the emotion could completely overwhelm her. They hadn't been sitting there 5 minutes when the approaches began. First came the middle-aged men in work shirts, the ones who'd claimed they were waiting for someone. They stood awkwardly beside the booth, hats in hand like schoolboys called to the principal's office. "We saw the news," one of them said quietly. "We saw what we did, what we didn't do. And we're sorry. We're really sorry." They each pulled out $20 bills, placing them on the table. "For your foundation," they said. "It's not much, but it's something." Then the family, mom, dad, the 2 kids who'd been coloring on placemats. The father's voice cracked as he spoke. "My grandfather was a veteran. I should have known better. I should have done better." His wife was crying, and the children looked confused but solemn, sensing the weight of the moment even if they couldn't fully understand it. They handed Arya an envelope containing $100 and a handwritten apology letter from the children, crayoned and heartfelt. But the moment that broke the room came when the elderly couple approached. The ones who hadn't even made eye contact, who'd looked away like Mason was invisible, like acknowledging his existence would somehow cost them something they couldn't afford to give. They were both crying now, the woman clutching her husband's arm for support, the man holding an envelope in his weathered hands. "We were wrong," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were so wrong, and we've lived with that shame every day since." Her husband handed the envelope to Arya with shaking hands. Inside was $500. Money they clearly couldn't easily spare, judging by their worn clothes and the way they looked at it like they were parting with something precious. "For the veterans," he said. "For all the ones we should have seen, but didn't." Mason reached across the table and took Arya's hand, and when he spoke, his words carried across the hushed diner so everyone could hear. "You taught a whole town what it means to see people," he said. "Not just veterans. People. The ones we walk past every day. The ones we've learned to ignore because it's easier than engaging, easier than caring, easier than admitting we have the power to make someone's day better or worse with the smallest gesture." Arya squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. "You taught me that one small act can start a revolution," she replied. "That kindness isn't weakness. That choosing to see someone when everyone else looks away isn't just nice. It's necessary. It's what holds the world together when everything else is trying to tear it apart." The diner remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not uncomfortable, not avoiding, but reverent. The silence of people witnessing something sacred, something true, something that made them want to be better versions of themselves. Frank, the owner, stood behind the counter wiping his eyes with his apron. Linda clutched her coffee pot like it was anchoring her to reality. And every single person in that diner understood that they were part of something now, part of a story that would be told for years to come, part of a moment when humanity remembered what it could be. If you believe one person can change the world, if you believe your actions matter even when nobody's watching, even when it's hard, even when everyone else is looking away, then comment, "I'll be that person right now." Make your mark. Be the one who pulls out the chair. Be the one who sees. Be the revolution. 1 year later, Arya Collins stood in front of a room full of veterans at the first annual gala for the foundation she'd named after her father, the Marcus Collins Veterans Transition Foundation. 53 veterans had been helped in that first year. 53 men and women who'd served their country and come home to a world that didn't know what to do with them. The foundation provided mental health counseling, job placement assistance, housing support, and something even more valuable, a community of people who understood that the war doesn't end when you come home. It just changes shape. Arya still worked her shifts at the hospital, still saved lives in the ICU, but now she also advocated for veteran care with the kind of passion that only comes from lived experience, from watching her father slip away, from understanding that the system was broken and someone had to fix it. Mason Hale had become something he never expected, a voice. He traveled to schools, veterans organizations, community centers, anywhere people would listen, speaking about visibility and dignity and what it meant to truly honor those who served. He talked about that morning in the diner, about the rejection that had felt like a second war wound, about the nurse who'd reminded him that humanity still existed. His speeches were raw and honest and deeply moving, and they changed minds everywhere he went. He challenged people to examine their own biases, their own discomfort, their own tendency to look away from what they didn't understand. And people listened. Because Mason wasn't just telling a story, he was living proof that how we treat our veterans matters, that one moment of kindness or cruelty can alter the trajectory of a life. They remained close friends, Arya and Mason. The kind of friendship forged in moments of profound human connection, the kind that doesn't fade with time or distance. When Mason got married the following spring to a woman he'd met at one of his speaking engagements, a social worker who understood his journey, Arya was there in the front row, crying happy tears, watching this man who'd once felt invisible walk down the aisle with his head held high and his heart finally whole. He'd found purpose again. He'd found love. He'd found himself. And it had all started in a diner booth with a woman who'd simply said yes when everyone else said no. Riverside Diner had changed too. Frank, the owner, had installed a permanent booth with a brass plaque that read, "Reserved for veterans," in honor of those who serve. It was never rented out for regular customers. It was held, always, for any veteran who walked through that door. And they came. Word had spread throughout the veteran community that Riverside Diner was a safe place, a welcoming place, a place where their service mattered. Frank trained his staff to recognize military bearing, to approach veterans with genuine gratitude, to make sure nobody ever felt invisible in his establishment again. The booth became something of a pilgrimage site, with veterans traveling from other states just to sit there, to be part of the story, to feel seen. Several of the 200 SEALs who'd stood in formation that dawn morning had become regular volunteers with Arya's foundation. They mentored newly transitioned veterans, helped with job placements, led support groups, and showed up for the kind of unglamorous, necessary work that doesn't make headlines but absolutely changes lives. They'd mobilized once for a dramatic gesture, but they stayed mobilized for the long, hard work of actually making a difference. Because that's what warriors do. They don't just fight battles, they hold the line, day after day, year after year, until the mission is complete. The impact was lasting, real, measurable in lives saved and futures rebuilt and communities transformed. This wasn't just a feel-good story that made the news for a week and then faded into memory. This was a movement, built on the simple foundation that every human being deserves to be seen, to be valued, to matter. Arya Collins didn't set out to change the world that morning. She didn't wake up with grand ambitions or heroic intentions. She was just an exhausted nurse who'd worked a brutal 16-hour shift, who desperately needed coffee and a moment of peace before going home to face bills she could barely pay and a life that felt small and invisible. She just chose to be human when everyone else chose comfort. She chose to see a person when everyone else saw an inconvenience. She chose to say yes when the entire world was saying no. And that choice, that simple, unremarkable, decent human choice, triggered a chain reaction that rippled across an entire country. 200 Navy SEALs showed up at her door not just to thank her, but to send a message that echoed far beyond that quiet residential street. The message was this: we see you when you see us. When you honor one of ours, you honor all of us. When you choose humanity over convenience, when you choose dignity over discomfort, When you choose to acknowledge sacrifice instead of looking away from it, we notice. And we never forget. In a world that has become frighteningly good at looking away, at scrolling past suffering, at choosing our own comfort over someone else's dignity. In a world that has trained us to avoid eye contact with struggle, to cross the street when we see someone who makes us uncomfortable, to say, "I'm waiting for someone," when we're really just waiting for an excuse not to engage. Be the one who pulls out a chair. Be the one who says, "Please, sit down." Be the one who sees the human being behind the uniform, behind the injury, behind the circumstances that make others uncomfortable. Because here's the truth that this story proves beyond any doubt. You never know when a simple act of kindness will trigger something extraordinary. You never know when buying someone breakfast will lead to a foundation that changes 50 lives in a year and hundreds more in the years to come. You never know when inviting someone to share your table will remind an entire community what humanity is supposed to look like. You never know when your small act of decency will become someone else's reason to keep going, to keep believing, to keep fighting. Arya and Mason still meet at that diner every few months. They sit in the same booth, drink the same mediocre coffee, and laugh about how one conversation changed everything. The check for $200,000 hangs framed in Arya's foundation office now, a reminder that kindness isn't just noticed, it's honored, multiplied, and sent back into the world to create more kindness. But more important than the money, more important than the foundation, more important than the news coverage and the viral videos and the speaking engagements, what matters most is that neither of them is invisible anymore. And neither are the veterans they help every single day. This story started with rejection and ended with revolution. It started with a man who felt invisible and a woman who chose to see him. It started with cruelty and ended with a community transformed. And it proves something we've forgotten in our fractured, disconnected, screen-obsessed world. One person can change everything. One moment can matter. One choice to be kind when it's easier to look away can trigger something so powerful it reshapes reality. So if this story moved you, don't just watch and move on. Don't just feel something for 60 seconds and then forget. Act. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell because these are the stories that matter. These are the moments worth amplifying. Share this video with everyone you know, not for the algorithm, but because this message needs to spread. Comment, kindness wins, if you're committing right now to be the person who says yes when everyone else says no. And tomorrow, when you're out in the world and you see someone who makes you uncomfortable, someone who needs help, someone everyone else is ignoring, be Arya. Pull out the chair. Start the conversation. Choose humanity. This isn't just a story. This is a movement. And the only question that matters is, will you join it?